Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us, especially on the last session for the EDU. We're so excited to see all of you in here. As we talk about, do students and society still value higher ed? And based on that last video, to remove some distractions, we are going to have no PowerPoints today. So it's just going to be us, no technology. We're talking about this really interesting topic about higher ed. And we know that nowadays Americans have lots of opinions. Not that they didn't before, but we have a lot of opinions about everything. And one thing we can all agree on is we have a lot of opinions about higher ed. And we all want to share them. Whether we've been to higher ed, tried higher ed, never touched higher ed, everyone seems to have an opinion. And if you were in the last session, they were talking a lot about the narrative out there and a lot of the negative narrative around higher ed. And we all see a lot of that. And the reality is when you ask people, and we're going to get into some of these data points, but when you ask people about higher ed, they go, oh yeah, people should get a certificate or certification. I'm losing confidence in the system that can deliver it. When you ask parents, what do you hope your child is going to get? What do you think they say? A bachelor's degree. People want their child to get a bachelor's degree. They see the value in a degree. They see the value in getting some form of post-secondary education. But the reality is they're losing confidence. Again, we'll get into the data. And we know why. It's not affordable. It's not accessible. They have issues trying to achieve that. And so when we see things in the media, it is about that. How can we ensure that more people have access and can succeed in post-secondary education, and that it delivers value on the other end. So those are the issues we're really going to dive into today, exploring some of that data, exploring some of the realities that we have in states and in the nation around these. And at Lumina, we are focused on this. We believe that education beyond high school is the way to prosperity, is the way to individual and community prosperity. And so we are working now toward a national goal that by 2040, 75% of Americans in the labor force will have a degree or a credential, like a certification or industry-based certification or certificate, that provide economic prosperity. To accomplish that, it's going to take everyone working on that. Policymakers, education leaders, community members, the federal government, all of us working together to actually accomplish this. So we're going to dig into these issues, and I am honored to be with some of the best in the field, some of the people that I look up to for advice on a regular basis. William Serrata, first of all, the president of El Paso Community College. Kim Hunter-Reed, the Commissioner of Higher Education for the Louisiana Board of Regents, and Stephanie Marken, a senior partner at Gallup. And I'm Courtney Brown, Vice President of Impact at Lumina Foundation. So let's dive in. What I'd like to start out with is first Stephanie providing some of the data that we've seen with the Gallup data. Again, we hear these narratives in the media about what people think. And so at Lumina, we teamed up with Gallup and we said, well, rather than talking about what people think, let's actually ask people, what's really going on? What are your perspectives? What's the reality that you are living with? And so, Stephanie, will you give us some of that? What are we seeing?
Yeah, thanks so much, Courtney, for allowing me to be a part of the discussion, for you all for joining us. As Courtney mentioned, we've been measuring really with discipline over the last 5 years attitudes towards higher education among all U.S. adults. When we started this study about 4 years ago now, and Courtney and I were imagining it together, we were really focused on the currently enrolled student perspective because, of course, at the time it was 2020 and so little was known about what currently enrolled students were experiencing on college campuses nationally amidst the pandemic. And then as the research began to grow, we said, well, if this is going to be the state of higher education study, it really needs to include individuals who've experienced higher education, have left higher education, those who've stopped out temporarily or unfortunately maybe permanently, as well as those who've never enrolled before in a degree granting or credential-based experience. So in totality, we interview 3 really distinct and important groups, all of which have no degree or credential completed. We interview currently enrolled students who are pursuing a 2-year, 4-year certificate or certification. We also interview those who've stopped out of one of those pathways, as well as those who've never before before enrolled in higher education. And the benefit of all of those perspectives and the large sample size in which we're collecting data is we can really dive into some of the subgroups and the nuances surrounding the conversation around higher education that the first panel so nicely teed up just before this session. And there have been a series of really important insights that we've released, by the way, all of which are publicly available. So if you have any interest in this research, and I'm going to cover like a tiny inch of it, so please do read more. All of that's available. If you just Google Lumina Gallup State of Higher Education Study, you'll come to our research hub and see the series of reports that we've released. But of course, the report and the finding for which we get, I think, the most questions, the most interest is our confidence in higher education data. Gallup has been measuring confidence in institutions for the better part of the last 25 or so years. We actually measure confidence in about 17 individual institutions in American society. Small business, big business, the military, the police, higher education was added in 2015. We also measure among Congress. Nobody does worse than Congress. So the good news is if you're in a list with Congress, you're always going to be second to last in the worst case scenario. But over the period of time, what we've seen really consistently is really a decline in confidence in all institutions. So we are a more anti-institution society than we've ever been in our history, and we certainly see that play out. So we ask individuals to what extent they have confidence in each of these institutions. They can say a great deal, quite a lot, some, very little or no confidence at all. When we added higher education to that list in 2015, at the time we saw a majority, 58% of Americans said they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher education. And then that number really steadily declined over time when we measured again in 2018, 2021. In 2023, when we measured, we calculated our lowest measure at 36%. And so 36% of people were saying they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher education. When we were set to measure again in the spring of 2024 in partnership with the Lumina team, we thought, well, this is going to fall again, right? Because if you imagine where you were in June of 2024, we're coming off the heels of quite a lot of press coverage surrounding the protests, and we thought that would inevitably impact overall confidence. What we were surprised by is that confidence actually didn't decline. The percent that said they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence stayed the same at 36%. But what was interesting is the percent that said they had very little or no confidence actually increased slightly, which means like so many of the metrics that we track at Gallup, people are more divided than ever in their confidence in higher education. So we have about a third of Americans who say they have a great deal or quite a lot, about a third that are in the middle at some, and then about a third that essentially have very little or no confidence at all. And certainly there are differences by subgroup. So naturally, you might expect there are differences by political party. We see Republicans are far more negative in terms of their overall confidence in higher education. Those who have additional education and training beyond high school themselves, groups that have been historically marginalized or underrepresented in higher education tend to be more positive and have greater levels of confidence, but even their levels have declined over time, which is what we've been tracking really closely at Gallup. Now, last year in partnership with the Lumina team was the first year we've ever asked why people have that stated level of confidence. So we first asked how much they had, and then as a follow-up we said, why do you have that level of confidence? Why do you have a great deal or quite a lot or some, very little or no confidence at all? For those who reported that they had very little or no confidence, there were three major reasons that were shared. And by the way, we asked them on an open-ended basis, so they could share anything that they wanted, and then we recoded their responses, which was really helpful to capturing kind of the totality of how people consider higher ed, which is such a personal experience for so many. We found the number one reason was concerns around propaganda, political issues on campus. Again, not surprising, especially given the timing in which we were surveying. The second most commonly reported reasons people had very little confidence was that they were concerned the skills that students were receiving in courses on campus weren't necessarily transferable or helpful in the workplace. And then the third most cited reason was cost. And cost is really a through line for us in all of this research that we've conducted over the last few years. It comes up for those who are currently enrolled and considering stopping out as the third most commonly reported reason they've considered leaving their post-secondary institution. It follows mental health and emotional stress issues that students report that they're having while enrolled. And then, of course, it's the number one reason those who are not currently enrolled report that they haven't chosen a higher education pathway. And that's despite a lot of interest. In fact, we find really high levels of demand. Essentially, 6 in 10 Americans who are not currently enrolled do not have a degree or credential say they've recently considered enrolling. So hopefully that gives some sort of optimism and hope to those of you in this room. But cost is obviously one of the most important issues that we're tracking over time in all of this research, because it is one of the major concerns Americans share with us. And we've looked at it through a few different lenses. This year, we took a really deep dive into cost and value in our State of Higher Education study in partnership with the foundation. And we'll be releasing a series of insights over the coming weeks, really focused on how people consider both the cost and the value of a post-secondary pathway. When we asked this year on the series of questions that we asked, one of the ones that I thought was most interesting was this question about fairness of price. We asked Americans the extent to which they thought that the prices 4-year and 2-year colleges were charging students relative to what they offered them was fair. And we asked about those two different pathways very intentionally because we saw differences between them. Only 18% of Americans for whom we surveyed said they thought that the costs charged by 4-year institutions were fair. And while it was more positive for 2 years, at essentially 4 and 10, we still saw a majority of Americans essentially saying the costs were unfair. On the flip side, when we look at issues of value, we do see a lot of positivity, and Courtney alluded to this in her earlier remarks, where you might think higher education is really broken, but you sure want your child to get a bachelor's degree, right? So there is that present certainly in our data. We actually see really high levels of value among those who we survey. So 70% of Americans for whom we survey who do not have a degree or credential themselves say they think a bachelor's degree is an extremely or very valuable pathway. And 60% say the same about an associate degree. And they also think that it pays off. We asked for the first time this year about how long you think it takes for an average college investment to pay off for somebody upon completion. And most Americans say it's within 5 years, and nearly all say it's within 10. So, people are always kind of trying to figure out the conflict between these two issues, right? People can have very little confidence in higher education, yet they're saying the outcome is very valuable. And I always liken it to healthcare. You can think healthcare in the United States is really broken and still believe that if you go to the doctor, you'll be healthier. And I think that's what we see in so many of these trends, with concerns around the institution, but a lot of belief still in the outcome of it. So I could share so many more points, but I'll stop there and turn it back to the panel.
Thank you. That's great. I mean, it's, these 3 issues that really came up, and the ones that I want to really dive into are the affordability and the skills mismatch that people perceive, because they're making this investment, their time and their money into getting these credentials, and they want to make sure they can get a job on the other end. We know that's why Americans go get post-secondary education, is to get a job. And so even when Americans are saying it's a fair price or it pays off in 5 years, it's still not accessible to so many people, and it often is the reason why people have to stop out. We have 42 million people now in the United States who started college and for whatever reason had to stop out, and a lot of times we've learned in the research with Gallup, it's because they can't afford it, and life gets in the way, other things. So Kim, I'm really interested to hear, how are you thinking about affordability in Louisiana and other places? What are some new models or some ways that we can ensure that people can access and succeed in higher education?
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be on the panel, and really appreciate the research, and really a big shout out to Lumina for focusing on credentials in the workforce in 2040 and setting that goal. I appreciate it. I would say that when we think about cost, when we think about affordability and attainment, I think about that really in 3 buckets right now. I think about adult education, right? They have this much time and money, this much aspiration. I think about transfer pathways, a place where people say there's so much academic snobbery because you say my math is better than yours, but I spent my time and money, got nothing for that perhaps. And then I think about dual enrollment, the opportunity for students to speed their time to a degree and save money. So those are places where I think we can certainly continue to lean into. For us in Louisiana, we finally have an adult financial aid program. We are a state that's trying, a poor state, so a state that's trying to make sure we're moving people from poverty to prosperity. We do that by making sure whatever entry point you are accessing, whether you're taking your kids to a public health clinic, whether you're applying for SNAP, whether you're applying for some other public benefit, that you are learning about the power of a credential and opportunity to access a credential. So this no wrong door approach, I think, is very important for individuals in terms of affordability and access. Transfer pathways, we had 400 faculty work on the 24 most popular disciplines in higher ed in Louisiana. and figure out with community college faculty and four-year faculty together how to do universal pathways. So now we don't have that conversation of your math is better than mine, your English is better, sorry, we don't take that one. So that, I think, is an important conversation, legislatively led responsibility to do that. And now we have 40,000 students participating in dual enrollment, high school students, 3 years of double-digit increases. And so saying to students and to families, start early, start now, because the high school diploma does not put you on that first rung of employment. But if you start skill building now, if you start your college journey in high school, you can save time and money, and you can get on a path that will allow you to be all that you want to be. I think those are the kinds of ways to think about policy and practice in ways that really do address this challenge of affordability and attainment. Much to be done to try to make sure that we address these issues. I'll mention one other thing. As I talk to students across the state of Louisiana and other places, we talk about the value of education, right? We believe in this work. We know it's transformational for families. And how many times have I had students say to me, you talk about this as a necessity, but you price it as a luxury good. And so how do we get to a place where we say opportunity is in the credential, and there is a pathway for you to get there? I think that's the important conversation we have to have.
Yeah. That's a fabulous takeaway. So William, as a president of a community college, one of the things that, as Stephanie said, there's so much data that we have. She could only present a little bit of it. But when we looked at the confidence of 2-year versus 4-year, confidence of 2-year institutions is much higher than 4-year institutions. And it's often seen, with fairer prices, a more affordable pathway, and especially short-term credentials, certificates and certifications being a pathway into these. So how do you think about both affordability at the 2-year institution and the future of these short-term credentials as affordable pathways in higher education?
Yeah, well, pleasure to be with you all, and thank you so much for the question. So a couple of things. I think it's important to note that we used to see higher education as a public good, and now we see it as a private benefit. You're going to benefit, you pay for it. And I think that that's what has triggered this whole concern. And I know the Gallup data well, and I certainly appreciate it. But I also know that once you get in the crosshairs, that you never get out. And, I can think back to 2004 when President Bush was running for re-election and said to Senator Kerry, look at Senator Kerry, he wants everyone to go to college, what a snob. And it resonated. And when something resonates in the political sector, it keeps going. And so now higher ed has been in the crosshairs since at least 2004, and so I think it'll continue to be. With regards to short-term credentials, I certainly agree with Dr. Reed. Dual credit, early college high schools, P-TECHs, these are methods of a student in high school. In the state of Texas, they have to go tuition-free for either early college high school or P-TECHs. P-TECHs are Pathways in Technology Early College High Schools. And so with those, we have an employer at the table, and they are saying if the student gets through this program, then we believe and we can guarantee that they'll have a job at the end of this program. So we have a lot of high school students in the state of Texas that say, I'm going to graduate from high school, I'm going to go straight into the workforce. Well, we want them to go into the workforce with a minimum of a living wage credential. And so in El Paso, we have about 9,500 students that are either dual credit, early college, high school, or P-TECH currently. In the state of Texas, we have about 400,000 students that are taking advantage of this. The short-term credentials, I think, are incredibly important. And we have to ensure, and we have a mechanism now in Texas, that those short-term credentials are now funded. In the past, they were never funded by the state. So if we offered them, we had to find ways to pay for them and allow our students to move forward with those. They're currently funded. In 23, House Bill 8 passed in the state of Texas, and it passed unanimously in both houses. So to tell me in today's body politic what legislation passes unanimously. We focused on the workforce, the future workforce of Texas. And the community colleges produce 96% of all career and technical education credentials in the state of Texas, so that was an obvious win for the state of Texas. The legislature poured $684 million additional dollars into the community college sector to be able to provide this, and short-term credentials were very much a part of that. Now, I've told my team in El Paso, we're not going to chase dollars. If we're going to offer an occupational skills award, or an institutional courses leading to certification, we're going to ensure that those are at minimum living wage jobs. And so we're seeing an increase in enrollment in those areas. And I think that that's a really important movement in the field.
That's great. You know, we hear a lot, again, in the media about skills-based hiring and not emphasizing degrees, or, you know, people removing the degree requirement from any jobs. And in the data I've seen, I haven't seen it play out that employers are really hiring more people without degrees. But I'm interested to hear how it's playing out in your states, and how we ensure the validity and the value of those degrees in the workforce.
So I would say that employers' business is the signal, right? What they're signaling is what people will value. I remember in my Colorado conversations, we were working on white-collar youth apprenticeship program, and business and industry, we talked about the bachelor's as the signal. Why are you doing that? And would you be willing to move away from the bachelor's as the signal for employment? And what we heard from the big employers was, yes, if there's someone that's validating this badge or this credential is of value, right? We don't want to do the work. Someone has to give us the gold seal to tell us whether it has value. So I think employers are open to these kinds of things if we make it easy for them to do that. We talk a lot about skills and competencies. I think that's very important. But if the employer and the HR offices across the country continue to use the bachelor's degree as the first check mark to get to the potential interview, then I think we're at cross purposes. So I think that's the piece that we have to continue to engage the businesses and industry to talk about what are you valuing, what skills are you looking for, and then of course making sure that our institutions are offering those so that when we go to them and say, you hired Courtney, would you hire 10 more of her? Is she job ready on day one? I think those are important conversations to have.
Yeah.
I certainly agree. I think that what we saw, and during the pandemic, we're 5 years out, thankfully, but during the height of the pandemic, we saw enrollment across the nation plummet, in particular at the community college sector. Mm-hmm. Now, as I looked at our data on a regular basis, and Courtney knows me well enough, I'm a data nerd, I'm knee deep in the data, I always recognize there's a face behind every single data point. What we noticed is that our career technical education programs that lead directly into employment surged. They grew every term of the pandemic. They continue to grow today. It was our general academic transfer programs that plummeted. And we're just now, this year, we're now starting to see those programs come back. And so I think it's incredibly important. So students are very savvy. And so what they said is, okay, during the pandemic, we all know that prices rose dramatically, the cost of labor rose dramatically, and what we saw was students were saying, I have an opportunity cost. I can make $15, $16, $17 an hour for a service level job to be in the front line, or I can go to college and sacrifice that wage. And what they told us by voting with their feet is, we're going to go into career technical education programs where I'm assured a job at the end of the program that is going to pay more than a living wage. And so I think that that's incredibly important. That's what we saw. That's what we continue to see. Those programs continue to grow. The issue in those programs is capacity. So nursing. I know everyone thinks of nursing as an academic program. It's a career and technical education program. We have capacity. You know, we can only have 12 nurses for we have to have clinical sites for them. All of these programs they have space capacity. And so it's harder for the community college sector to be able to build and to be able to provide those programs. But we've continued to see them grow since the pandemic and through the current period of time.
Can I add to William's very good point? I want to go back to his unanimous approval of a piece of legislation, right, which you just never see. But I think it reminds us that workforce is a purple issue.
Absolutely.
And if we're going to be successful, education has to be purple. Mm-hmm. People have to see themselves and understand that they need to support it regardless of their party affiliation. And so when we see places where there's bipartisan support, hardly ever anymore, I think we have to go to where that energy is and say, what are people excited about? What brings people together? And this idea of opportunity and prosperity around workforce, I think, is an important place. I'd like you to comment on that.
Yeah, well, I think the part that gives me kind of hope for the future is the fact that the outcome piece, right, the extent to which you believe that the degree is valuable is actually not partisan split for us in our data. We find Republicans and Democrats are just as likely to report that a degree, a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree is extremely or very valuable. So while we do see that partisan split on the institutions and confidence in them, we don't see it in the outcome piece around value. So I think maybe that's the purple issue in this conversation, which can be kind of the focus.
I think there's one other key point. So I present in front of our community on a regular basis, and I obviously am an ambassador for the institution. And so I'll present in front of a community group, and there'll always be someone that will raise their hand and say, well, college isn't really for everyone. You can get by without college. And so my question always is, are your children going to college? Whose children don't have to go? I mean, I think that's really the key point. And by and large, every single degree and certificate pays off. And it may take longer. I have degrees in English. It may take longer for English degrees to catch up, but they do. The data is very clear that they do catch up, and then they many times exceed on the earning capacity. So I think that that's a really important piece of it. It's always, well, higher ed may not be right for those kids, but it's right for my kids.
I mean, I think going back to being a data geek, because we share that, all of us, I think, on this panel share that. And, while we have all these data that show if you have a degree or credential, you're more likely to make more money of your lifetime, be healthier, be more civically minded, all of these positive outcomes. And we, as people that sit in education, keep yelling those out. But people in the audience don't always, that's not their reality. That's not what they feel on a regular basis. And we all have an aunt who has a neighbor who has a second cousin whose daughter went to Yale and they live in their basement, right? Everybody knows that person. Yet it does pay off. And we can keep shouting that, but I think we need to take a moment and step back and go, okay, wait, we hear you. And we know we need to do better. So as I mentioned, Lumina is working toward this national goal that by 2040, 75%, I'm going to just repeat it again to make sure you understand it, 75% of people in the labor force, working age people, will hold a degree or credential that provides an economic value, 15% over a high school alone. So currently, we have the 75% goal, and currently in the United States, we are at 44%. That means 44% of people have a degree or credential, and it provides this 15% premium. So what we're seeing is that not every credential or degree is providing that 15% premium. About 70% of bachelor's degrees are, and some of it maybe it takes a minute for it to pay off. You may work at Starbucks for 6 months while you're looking for a job or other things that are happening. It could be a personal reason, many things. But some of those credentials are not valuable. And so when we're thinking about, all of us working on this together moving forward and knowing it's a purple issue, knowing that people want these credentials because they want a job, it's about the workforce. How do we rebuild this confidence? How do we, on our end, not just rebuild the confidence, but do something to change the reality so that these credentials do pay off and do provide value?
Yeah, I'll begin. So a couple of things. So that was the legislature in 2023. The legislature, and so you're all in Texas. Thank you for spending money in our state. We certainly appreciate that. And Texas has been blessed with a robust economy. And so this year, the legislature is in session right now. So if you go over to the Capitol, you'll see lots going on there. And I'm spending a lot of time in Austin as well, because I have to advocate on behalf of the community college sector, on behalf of our institution specifically. But, they're going into the session with a $22 billion surplus, which is great. Last session, they went into the session with a $30 billion surplus. So there was an opportunity to invest. And they have invested in higher ed the last couple of sessions rather dramatically. But they're also being really strategic about it. There's 2 bills that I'd mentioned that address specifically what you're looking at. There's 2 bills in the state of Texas, a House Bill 281, identical bill in the Senate, Senate Bill 757, which would restrict college degrees, this is at the baccalaureate level, which lead to low-paying jobs. So again, they're going to drive our actions in the academy and higher education based on what they're willing to fund. Now, it doesn't mean that we'd stop offering those respective programs, but we need to make sure that we're advising students appropriately and say, look, if you're going to go into this program, here's the wage that you're going to earn. And to be honest, and to build, as you indicated earlier, short-term certifications that we can build into those programs. That you can say, okay, you're going into English, but let's build a data analytics piece of that degree so that you have a skill within that respective degree. So I think the legislature will drive a lot of this, and they're getting much more smart about how to drive it. And I'm the first to say, I think all of our degrees and certificates are valuable. But if the state's going to say, we're no longer going to fund this, so I'm going to be able to I'm going to provide our students with the advice and counsel to let them know. It doesn't mean I'll stop offering it, but I need to let them know, here's the wage, the expected wage you can expect to earn out of this particular degree.
Yeah, can I ask a follow-up question on that? So just to be clear, when you're thinking about the types that they may not fund, that they would cut, people are often concerned, well, does that mean you're only going to have engineering degrees? Does that mean all the teacher jobs, the nursing jobs, are going away? And that's not reality, because those do pay off, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's a great question, because in particular at this conference, I would imagine there was at least a session or two on artificial intelligence. And so as someone who holds degrees in English, I feel much more emboldened now, because I keep hearing, well, with the advent of AI, the liberal arts and social sciences degrees are going to be more powerful, because they're going to be able to do the kinds of things that the machines can't do. They're going to be able to practice empathy. They're going to have critical thinking skills, things of that nature. And so it's somewhat of a renaissance of those respective degrees coming back. What we've negotiated and what we've spoken at the community college sector with our Commissioner of Higher Ed is there's a number of degrees in our area of funding that may fall off. And some of those may be in those specific areas. And so I said, okay, with the advent of AI, all of a sudden these are going to be deemed credentials of value in the future. How would we pull them back into the funding mechanism? And so those are the kinds of negotiations that are occurring right now during the legislative session. And you're right, they do pay off.
And I think they pay off in ways beyond earnings, right? We talk a lot about this at Gallup, right? Like, what does someone's purpose well-being look like? We've been tracking well-being for the last 30 or so years at Gallup, and what we know is well-being is essentially in a crisis state in the United States right now. That's why we see so many students saying that's why they've considered stopping out of a post-secondary pathway. When we look at well-being, we look at it in 5 interrelated elements, one of which is your purpose on a day-to-day basis. Do you get fulfillment from what you're doing? Do you enjoy it? Do you feel engaged in your work? And what we know from the research with you all in the Education for What study a few years ago is that for those people who have additional education and training beyond high school, they're far more engaged at work. They have higher levels of purpose well-being. And that's really important too, right? People aren't just going for a job, they're going for a good job, right? A job for which they define meaning. And that's particularly true for this younger generation reaching the workforce. They are describing a desire for purpose in a way we've never seen before in any generation before them. And anytime I share that result, people always say, oh, isn't that just because they're young and purpose sounds good when you're 18 to 25 years old? But we don't find that's the case when we look at people who were in a similar formative life stage as them, answering those same questions. They were not as enamored and obsessed with finding purpose and meaning in their work. So I think as we think about other outcomes of some of those degrees, which we know are high mission, high demand, high need jobs like teaching and nursing, I think we also have to think about what purpose looks like for people, because they're not just going for a job, they're going for a really great job.
So I have a couple of observations on this. First of all, I think that when you have the conversation about the wage plus up from a credential, it requires you to have good data, right? So where is the data that allows us to understand the labor market response for these various credentials? Where is the robust data? So we're working, as other states are working and toiling to try to figure out how to connect and share data, so we have that information. That's important. One way we are looking at that specifically in Louisiana is our adult financial aid program requires that you be in one of 5 high demand, high wage areas. We now have data from 2 years of student graduates or student enrollments, and so now we're able to look to see we have good news. Those who have graduated, and we have the data, they're plus $20,000 in their earning from when they started. But we also now have a responsibility to say, what was the earning opportunity versus what you would have just gotten in retail or working at fast food? And if the credential did not yield an earning that was beyond that, a credential of value, we should take it off the list. But we have to have the data. We have to have a commitment to the analysis. We have to have a commitment to be actionable to get that done. So I think that's important. The other thing I would say, you mentioned, I think all of you mentioned consumer information. So we talk a lot about pathways. We talk a lot about prosperity. We are terrible in this country doing career navigation and career exploration, right? We don't talk to little people about what do you want to be when you grow up. If you meet an 11th or 12th grader right now, you're going to say, where are you going to go? And they're going to name a college. You're not going to ask them, what do you want to be? Right. And the right question is, what are you going to be? And then talking about career exploration, career navigation, have you met someone who's doing that, purposeful work, those kinds of conversations. So there's significant mindset shift that we have to do to make sure that we're stepping into this space in a way that really does yield better results for people.
So today, sitting today with the systems we have, what is one piece of advice you would give that student or a family in trying to navigate this post-secondary world?
You know, so I'm a first-generation college student. You know, my parents didn't have the opportunity to go to college, and what they told me as I was growing up, and I did well in K through 12, but they said, William, we don't want you to have to work as hard as we have to work to make ends meet. And so that means you need to go to college. They had no concept. They didn't go. They didn't have no concept of what college meant. But I'm the oldest of four, so I went to college, and I struggled. I struggled tremendously in my undergraduate. It took me 6 years to earn the 4-year degree. Went in as an engineering major, came out with a degree in English, my native tongue. So my dad was not real pleased. But
look at you now.
Well, I'm still a work in progress. But I continued, and I worked in higher education. I was fortunate to get hired in higher education, and I asked, how do you move up? Well, you need a master's degree. A master's degree in what? It doesn't matter. So I was studying Shakespeare in the evenings and writing enrollment reports during the day. And so the engineering did pay off, had some technical skills that were good, and they paid off on the analysis of data and things of that nature. But all of my siblings have multiple degrees. So I mean, I'm living testimony on the power of education in this nation. And for me, I work in the field, but it's more personal than that. And I want students to have the same opportunity that I had. And I think that higher education is the great equalizer, and it allows people to go in and to receive, whether it's now a certificate, an associate's degree, a baccalaureate, or beyond, it allows them to earn that opportunity to make it in society. And I think that's incredibly important. We're at a time where this generation, we keep hearing, is the first generation that won't achieve as much as their parents did. And the only way that they will achieve it, from my perspective, is through higher education. It is the clearest pathway to the middle class. And so that's what I try to share with families and with students, whether I'm speaking to them in Spanish or speaking to them in English. I think it's incredibly important for them to understand that and to invest in that. And again, it doesn't surprise me that the Gallup data is where it is, because again, higher ed's in the crosshairs, and it's not going to come out of it. But we have a responsibility to share with individuals what the possibilities are for them.
So I would say to students and to families, first, find your joy. Identify the skills and competencies that you love. What do you love doing? What are you thinking about, so that we can monetize that? Second, self-advocate. Do not be shy about trying to figure out where to go and who to be and what you want to do, because we are all in the business of helping people and educating students, so that we can, work with those individuals. And then I would say be a part of education, right? We want to make sure that you have that opportunity, whether you are a student who is starting in high school with your dual enrollment, whether you are a student who's heading into a community college or technical college or a four-year institution. And I think we still have to say community college is college. When people keep saying Is college for everyone? Well, yes. Community college, technical college, four-year institution, right? It's all college. Yes, there's a place for you. So I think those things are really important for students and families, that they feel welcome, that they understand how to monetize their passion, and that they're self-advocating so that they can navigate.
And Courtney, I'd add one other thing. We have to be honest with the data as well. So Georgetown University puts out a report annually, the Center on Education and the Workforce. They released their latest report, The Future of Good Jobs. These are jobs that pay at least a living wage in 2024, and it indicates that by 2031, so I know that seemed a lot like really far away a few years ago. It's only 6 years or less than 6 years away now. 72% of all jobs will require some post-secondary education or training. So we have to be honest with students. In our state, and very proud Texan, fourth generation on one side, at least fourth generation on the other side, but we have only 52% of Texans go to college immediately after high school. And it's incredibly important that they do it immediately after high school, because I've done the analysis. In El Paso, if you don't go immediately after high school, the likelihood that you graduate from college is 1%. When I lived in South Texas, the likelihood was 0.8%. So it was one of the things I was like, President Obama, please stop talking about gap years for your daughters, because it doesn't work for our population. So I think it's incredibly important that we share the data with them. They proved during the pandemic that they're very savvy consumers. And so we have to share the data and be honest with them as well.
Yeah. Anything?
The last thing I'll add is I think some of our research last year was a really helpful glimpse into just how difficult it is for folks to navigate how much it'll actually cost to attend a higher ed institution. We investigated last year for the first time just how good or bad people were at estimating total cost of attendance in their state. Our hypothesis was that people were going to be terrible at it, and I actually thought everyone would overestimate cost of attendance because, of course, stories like Vanderbilt being $100,000 a year were reaching some families. I thought everybody's going to think it's so much more expensive in their state than it actually is, because we always hear from schools who say, how can people think it's too expensive? It's practically free at my particular system, my particular state. What we found actually was that a lot of people were underestimating the cost of attendance. They were actually very off in their thoughts around what it would cost for them to enroll, but not in the direction we anticipated, where we thought they'd all think it was way more expensive. Some of them actually underestimated the total cost. And then for those who underestimated cost of attendance by more than $5,000 a year, we found that they still said it was too expensive to go to college in their state. So cost was still a major barrier for them. So I think it is really hard. I was also that first gen student who was trying to figure out what's it going to cost me to go to college when I was enrolled, and it was really hard for me to understand my total cost of attendance at any one of those 4 planned years. And I think it remains that confusing for consumers. So something about our communications around costs is not reaching folks, and they are very off in their estimate about what it would actually take for them to enroll.
I think most people probably spend more time on Amazon reading all the reviews for a $50 coffee maker than on a college. So we are going to open it up to questions in just a minute. I can't actually see out there, but I believe there are microphones down the center. So if you have questions, feel free to hopefully find your way to a microphone. While we're doing that, let me ask, we, right now I feel like we're all talking about all these challenges and negative things and why we can't move forward on certain things. So I'd love to hear, what are some opportunities that we have so we can move these agendas forward? You talked a lot about purple issues. Are there others, or do you want to expand on any of that?
So I do think that this idea of prosperity and opportunity, really finding the places where people can come together, where we can agree, the common ground conversation. Everyone in this country, every family wants their child to do well, to do better. Every legislator wants to be responsive to their constituents. And so I do think it's important for us to meet that common ground moment to talk about what do we represent in talent development, in opportunity, in prosperity, and that this conversation around consumer information is important to say to families, the knowledge economy is demanding this. Right? If you want a job, a good job, a great opportunity to support yourself and your family, the credential of value is the path to that. So I think that's really important. I can remember many conversations with communities that are underrepresented who will say, you want to push college on all of our children, or Native communities that say our students go and they don't come back, or they don't come back Native. So this conversation about how do we meet the moment and share that the economy is changing, the reality is changing, but there's opportunity there for individuals to be all that they want to be, to have this ability to support themselves and their families, and to talk about education as economic development, as workforce development. To your point, it's not just the me responsibility and the me benefit, it's the benefit of all. And how do we think about that? So I think those are the things that I'm excited about. And certainly, in my job, I get to go to a lot of commencement ceremonies. And so I see the students on the arena floor and parents and loved ones to the rafters cheering on when they hear that name called. People are still cheering for talent development. They love the fact that they can support their individual family members. And so we have to continue to lean into that.
I think Dr. Reed said it perfectly. I agree wholeheartedly. I think it's incredibly important for us to share the success stories. I think it's important to partner with the legislature. I know we think of today's society, and I even spoke to it, but we're in a really good position in Texas. The legislature has invested heavily in higher education over the last couple of sessions, and we're seeing the dividends of that. Texas now has 16 R1 universities, Research 1 universities. We now lead the nation. So we have more than California, we have more than New York, but it took an investment to reach that. And we also see the opportunity costs if we lose talent to other states. And I think that that's the realization that has helped the legislature invest in our youth. We're looking at what's going to build a talent-strong Texas for the foreseeable future. Currently have the 8th largest economy. The data indicates that in a couple of years we'll have the 7th largest economy in the world. And so that takes investment. And I think that there's that opportunity.
Thanks. Did you want to add any quick thing? Okay. All right, so we're going to, I can see you. If you would just say your name and location and.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Rebecca Charles. I'm with the Robin Hood Foundation in New York City. And obviously we talked about this, but a lot of the reason that the data shows economic mobility when you get a degree is because of the jobs requiring that degree. So on a more basic level, how do you respond to young people and even parents who say, what I do in my everyday job had nothing to do with what I learned in school? How do you combat that mentality? Because I hear that all the time.
Yeah, please, Dr. Reed.
So I do think that this conversation about value is a conversation about relevance, right? And so I think that point is a really important one. For us, I think the evolution of this work is around demonstration of work-based learning, apprenticeship, internship, those kinds of things. And there was some research I saw where they were talking about students understanding the connectivity of their skill building to the world of work. And they said, if every faculty member in the class says, today we're going to talk about fill in the blank, and it will have value for you in the workplace because it will allow you to analyze data, et cetera, then there's a connection there. People are helping make the connection. Because I do think that people will say, why did I take algebra? Why am I doing this? But then when you really unpack it, there are all of these skills, foundational skills, content skills, that education has helped to prepare you for.
I do think you're picking up on something we see quantitatively, where we find relevance is actually a more important predictor of whether or not you feel like your degree is worth the cost. Even things like U.S. News and World Report ranking, how highly selective your institution was, relevance is still more important than all of those more traditional factors that many people usually equate to a high value degree. So I do think in totality, people are evaluating the quality of the degree and thinking directly about what was the skill that I gained. I was a political science major, but I took a statistics class, right? So, there are ways to introduce that into a liberal arts degree. We don't find, by the way, that the liberal arts students are really struggling or suffering on this metric in the way that you might anticipate and that many people do anticipate. So it's a problem across all disciplines for sure, pretty much equally.
And some of the most important skills aren't ones you can quantify and take and say, this is statistics, and you're using statistics. You're working with negotiation, group, skills, ability to listen to other perspectives, which is, the way you do your job better. But, I think you're onto something about say what it is. Now we're going to work in group skills because that's important in the workplace. And, years ago I was doing some survey work, and we asked people about networking. How was the networking at this conference? And everybody's like, it's horrible. There was no networking. The next year, they didn't change anything in the agenda. They just called it networking time, and everyone rated it like, this is amazing networking. And so I think a lot of times you just have to call it out and say it at the beginning, and then say it again at the end, and people are like, oh, okay, I get it now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris Morgan. I'm an academic advisor at Austin Community College, and so I'm a strong believer in community college graduate. So I have kind of a two-part question. The first is, Stephanie sort of started off with a lot of great statistics. Where can I find those? Is that at one report, or are you quoting lots of reports?
Great question. Yeah, it is across a lot of reports, but if you email me, Stephanie_Marken@gallup.com, I'll send you all the reports. But if you also just go to news.gallup.com and you just put in Lumina's name, you're going to come up against all of them, so that they're included there. But if there's a specific one, feel free to email me.
For sure.
We also have them all on the Lumina Foundation website.
Oh, okay, excellent. My more general question is, in a lot of ways, we benefit from having UT right next door, basically. We get the benefit of their resources without having to worry about a lot of the things that UT has to worry about. But in a lot of ways, we do compete with them. I do advising for computer science information technology. So we have some bachelor's degrees at our community college, which you might have some at yours as well. I think sometimes people think expensive equals valuable. And when they come to our community college, we're saying, here's free tuition, stick with us, get a cheaper bachelor's degree. How do you talk about an inexpensive path to a bachelor's credential that doesn't sound like a cheap or fake bachelor's degree to people?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And so I speak to the value of higher education. I think that all higher education has value, but I don't say that we're cheap. I say we're the best value of higher education in our community. And I'm very frank of showing, what the tuition rates are at the surrounding institutions and what ours is. I will say one thing, and you don't have to agree with me, and many don't. The promise programs, the college promise programs have gained a lot of steam over the last number of years. I've always had an issue because I don't feel that people value free. And I think that that's part of the issue with a promise program. So we were one of the institutions a number of years ago during the pandemic. I had a cryptic email, and I thought it was a phishing email, but I decided to respond. Next thing you know, I'm on a phone call with a group. And then like 3 weeks later, we had $30 million wired to us from the Mackenzie Scott group. And so what we did is we created a student success endowment fund with that money. I worked with our board and asked them to do that. But we didn't create a promise program. We've created a scholarship program because you earn a scholarship. And the student has to have skin in the game. They pay for they pay for 4 hours. The college pays for 8 hours. So they're a full-time student. They can renew it up to 6 semesters. But I think that people value what they pay for. And I think that free, at least for me, it's hard for me to see people value free.
And quantitatively, they don't value it. So if you look at the relationship...
I knew it was data informed.
That's right. If you look at the relationship, so years ago when we partnered with Lumina and Purdue University on the Gallup Purdue Index, we looked at belief your degree is worth the cost. Then we looked at the total amount that you borrowed in order to obtain that degree. And of course, the more you borrowed, the less likely you were to believe your degree was worth the cost, except for if you had a series of quality experiences while you were enrolled, an internship, you felt cared for, you had a mentor, it totally blunted the impact of that student loan debt. So then you had somebody who was heavily indebted by our metric, who actually was more likely than somebody who borrowed $0 to say their degree was worth the cost. So hopefully that's an encouraging statistic.
Yeah, I was just going to add that one of the things that we see in the community colleges of and for the community is that connection to the world of work. So the apprenticeship, the internship, the networking opportunities that you can provide, I think are invaluable. That's your market.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Brian Reed, University of Montana. How do you reconcile what we know are the civic and individual outcomes of the BA with the Lightcast Strata data that shows that 52% of BA holders are underemployed at the point of graduation, and 45% of those 10 years after graduation, the majority of whom are Black, Hispanic, Latino, the majority of whom come from institutions that are open access with high proportions of low-income students? And I'll note, I'm not picking on you. Louisiana's 47%, Texas is 43%, Montana is 51%.
Right. So I'll make a couple of observations. Obviously, it's not just earning the credential, right? It's the social network. And if you don't build the social network, and we don't say to individuals, the credential is valuable, but all the work and all the networking and all the opportunities that you build and scaffold are as important. I think that is critical. I'll share an observation I made when we were looking at our dual enrollment report, because we were very excited and committed to making sure more students start their higher ed experience in college. I would like to see, full disclosure, high school redesign where students are getting that first credential in high school in their senior year, right? So I think that's where we have to go as a country. But on the way there, we were looking at the dual enrollment information, and what we found in the state of Louisiana is the more diverse your high school is, the less likely you are to participate in dual enrollment. And so the question is it no one's promoting it? Is it no one's offering it? Is it no one's talking about it? Like, what is happening there? So I do think in this world of conversations around equity of opportunity that we have to be aggressive in asking these questions around what is happening with these students who are not seeing the results, and why not. For us, I think in higher education, it is a conversation around intentional skill building early on. So for example, when I went to school long ago in college, I went to college to get a job, and the career services offices was a last semester last thought, not a first semester first thought. And if we're serious about this education to employment pathway for students, it has to be a first semester first thought. When you start early, you skill build, you network the students, they do apprenticeship and internship that is rigorous and real, then we will change those numbers. That's what it's going to take, in my opinion. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Hello, E.T. Windsor, recently with the U.S. Department of Education. My question really is directed towards first generation. Many of us are in families who were first generation or had someone, and it spurred a lot of people in the community as well as the rest of the family to go on. How do we make sure today that a first generation experience doesn't result in that being kind of the last generation that goes?
Yeah. I think it's a great question. And I think it, when we talk about, Courtney mentioned earlier that only 44%, and we're looking at 75% having a credential by 2040, a value-driven credential by 2040. And I think we have to go back to those stop-outs that I mentioned earlier. It's 42 million, it's 4.2 million in the state of Texas. We need to be able to help them that have credits and no credential get back and earn a credential. If we didn't learn anything from the pandemic, we learned we could do in a 2-week time period, go from face-to-face courses to completely online. And online doesn't work for everyone, I understand that, but we have an opportunity to be able to help those adults that have credits and no credential get back in and earn it. Then we have to do what you're referencing and creating a college-going culture where college-going isn't always seen as the best thing to do in the media, among other areas. And so I think that we have to be able to do that. I agree with Dr. Reed. We have to share, those services that we waited until the end, we've got to do those up front. We have to do them as they're dual credit students, as they matriculate into higher education, as they're going forward. I mean, like 60% of my students work. They don't work because they want to work. They work because they have to work. And so we have to be able to schedule around them to be able to provide the coursework when they need it, to be able to to help them get through, and then to help them get into that next phase. So, we're really focused now. The last, EPCC, we're focused on entry, progress and pathways, completion, and then career. In the past, we've never focused on that. But we're very specifically focused to make sure that they either go into a living wage job or that they transfer and they're successful at the university. And I think that that's a responsibility that you're going to see more and more higher ed institutions take on.
In your question, I heard a lot of interest in the first-gen student experience. And I will say, one of the data points that I thought was a little startling from our recent research in partnership with Lumina was the % of students who said they've considered stopping out because they feel like they don't belong. And when we asked as a follow-up, why didn't you feel like you belong, we heard a lot about issues of income and income inequality and the feeling like they couldn't really engage fully in the experience because they were a first-gen student, a lower-income student, and maybe they couldn't have that internship on campus or, work honestly in an internship at all because they're often unpaid, as we all know. And they couldn't really engage in the campus community because they had to work a really challenging off-campus job that totally pulled them away from the institution. They didn't necessarily find their niche, et cetera. The only reason I work at Gallup is because I had a polling center internship, and the only reason I had a polling center internship at Elon because it was the best paying job on campus, actually. You got to listen to people talk to strangers, and I thought, this is so fun. But that made it possible for me to actually have a job, right? And so I think a lot about the first-gen students and just how hard it is for them to feel a part of the community because of so many of those factors that are impacting them. Just making more jobs available on campus that are actually paid jobs, well-paid jobs, makes such a difference.
So I've talked a lot about our 2040 goal that we're working on for the nation. But in 2008, we set a 2025 goal, and that was 60% of Americans will have a credential. It was an attainment goal, so without the labor market premium on it. And we've been working on that for the last 15 years with partners on the stage, with many of you in the audience. And as a nation, when we were in 2008, we were at 38%. Only 38% of Americans held a degree. As of today, 54% of Americans have a degree. 55% have a degree or a credential, certificate or certification. That's a huge increase over 15 years. And that is increases across the board. That is increased for first gen, that is increased for low income, that is increased for every single state in the United States. That is increased for people of color. So we are increasing. And the other interesting thing is in 2008, when this goal was set, the younger population, the 25 to 34, had a lower attainment rate than the full working age population. Since then, they have actually not just met the general population, but that younger population is increased over the general population by almost 2 percentage points, which is pretty amazing. So that's great news for our country. There's a lot of work we still need to do, and we need to make sure that, while we have that attainment rate, that it is a credential of value. That's why we're switching our focus, and while we increase attainment, also increasing on that credential of value. But as somebody, I'm trying to be more glass half full these days. We have a lot of really good things that are happening, a lot of momentum, and we all need to work together to continue that momentum and continue this. I am having the 0 time flashing at me. So with that, I would like to say thank you for my panelists. You'll understand why these are some of my favorite people in the field. They're amazing. So if you could all give them a thank you. Yeah. And thank you to all of you for your participation and for coming on the last EDU. Really appreciate it. Have a great afternoon.